Hello, and welcome to Money Matters, the economics of self and traditional publishing. My name is Robin Sullivan, and I'm going to be taking you through the various costs and income potential for publishing through these two methods. Now, who am I, and why am I doing this? So I'm the business manager of author Michael J. Sullivan. He is a best-selling fantasy author. In the past, I have been a small press publisher. I no longer have that press. It was too much work for me, and I needed to focus on my husband's work. I've been in the publishing business for over 11 years. My first published book was in October of 2008, and I run the largest writers group in the Washington, D.C. area called Write to Publish. I started doing seminars for that in February of 2008, and that currently has a membership of about 2,600 writers. I've also done hundreds of business lectures, from anything from agents to marketing. I've done presentations at Writers Digest University, and I've also been at a number of writers' conferences and workshops. Okay, now before I go on with the presentation, I want to take just a moment to talk about Michael and his career. And the reason why I want to do this is many times when I'm in a lecture and I'm listening to someone talk, I want to know whether they have any experience, any results in what they're discussing. And many times I'll be sitting there and later on I find out this is some author who sold like 500 books or something of that nature. And so that makes me wonder, like, why should I listen to this person? Do they really know what they're talking about if they're not getting any substantial sales? So I just want to let you know a little bit about Mike. He's been on the New York Times twice, 3 times on USA Today. I forget how many times on the Washington Post bestsellers list. But he's been at this for a while. His first published book was in 2008. His first traditionally published book was in 2011. And he's written 33 books, 17 of which are published, 2 are pending release, and there's 13 books that are just in a trunk and they'll never see the light of day. So his income started becoming high enough for me to quit my day job back in April of 2011. So he's been doing very well at that. We are what's termed as a hybrid author, which means we use self-publishing. We've also have several contracts with the Big Five and a couple of small press contracts as well. Michael sold over 2 million English language books. He has been on best of or most anticipated lists more than 250 times. And he has 8 Goodreads Choice nominees, which are a very hard nomination that is done by a very large website dedicated to bibliophiles. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is the money side of things. And I wanted to point out there's nothing wrong with just writing for personal fulfillment. If you just want to write and, maybe not be looking at earning money off your writing, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But my focus today is going to be on how to generate an income. So it's going to be focused on the income side of things. A couple things that I want to mention is that usually first books are not publishable. So if you sit down and you write your first novel, usually that is not going to be good enough to be released. In some very rare instances, it turns out that first written books can be published, but usually it takes several books for you to get your voice, to find your storytelling ability, to really get something that is of a publishable quality. In fact, Mike's first published book was his 14th novel. A couple of metrics to throw out for you. Malcolm Gladwell says you should spend 10,000 hours working on anything. And Stephen King says you should treat your first 1 million words as practice. So my point here is, if you're planning on making money from your writing, realize that it's a very long-term endeavor and that you have to put in this type of work up front in order to make any decent money at it. Okay, now when we started into the publishing world, we had no idea what to expect. We didn't know what an average advance was. We didn't know how much money these authors made. We didn't know how many copies of books people should sell to expect, on a yearly basis. And that's because a lot of traditional publishers, they they don't like it when their authors talk about money. So it's not really talked about in traditional publishing circles. Now, the self-publishing authors that started coming about around, I'd say about 2010, they started sharing their information more liberally. And a lot of people don't believe the types of numbers that they're posting, although I can tell you that I've actually seen people's reports from Amazon, and so I know that their numbers are true. And it is true that many self-published authors are making six figures. That's not to say that you're going to make six figures if you're self-published. I'm just saying that there are a lot more six-figure self-publishers than one would think. A couple of other things to remember. Most authors, even ones with names that you would recognize, still have their day jobs. Most authors do not earn a full-time living. My husband happens to earn a full-time living. As I said, I quit my job back in April of 2011. But when you look at self-publishing and traditional, and look at it at various levels, you kind of look at the mid-list, you look at kind of a debut author, and you look at someone who's kind of on the higher end. We found that you can get some pretty similar results in both self and traditional. In other words, if you look at the number of people who are pursuing traditional, many of which who will not make it, and you look at the number of people who self-publish, many of which will not sell, the percentages of authors who actually make, let's say, $50,000 a year is relatively the same in both of those pools, if you count the pools such that the traditional published authors are the ones who are still working at getting through the query pool. The other thing I should mention is that you generally can't make a good living on just one book. Sure, every once in a while, you have something like Catcher in the Rye or To Kill a Mockingbird, and additional books aren't needed, but in most authors who are making a good living, they're career authors, they're putting out books very regularly, at least once a year, maybe once every 2 years at the longest. There are also a lot of self-published authors who do something called rapid release, where they're literally putting out 10, 12, 15 books a year. There are some authors who can do that, and to them I say more power to you. We've never been in a position to be able to publish that quickly. It takes us much longer to put out a good quality book. Okay, so let's talk about traditional versus self-publishing. Now, in traditional publishing, the majority of your income is going to come from your advances. The reason why I say that is most authors don't earn royalties. And by royalties, I mean income that exceeds the amount of the advance. Only 20% of the books, quote unquote, earn out. So the advance is the only money that you're going to be seeing. The other thing to keep in mind is that advances are a lot smaller than you probably think they are. An average debut author will get somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 per book. That's been that way for a very long time. If anything, we've seen advances gone down. We have not seen any momentum of advances going up. If you are writing in a market such as fantasy and science fiction, those are genres that do very well in foreign markets, particularly in places like France and Germany, Russia, Spain. You can see some substantial additional income when you're traditionally published through foreign language sales. Again, that's going to depend on the market. If you're writing, I don't know what the market is, for instance, for romance overseas. I'm going to suspect it's not as strong as science fiction and fantasy. And then, of course, there's movie and television options. Generally, this is not very much money. Michaels has 2 properties that are optioned, and it's an insignificant blip on our income statement for those, even if they get renewed, which they generally do. Obviously, if the book is made into a movie, then it's substantial money. But then I also know some authors who've gotten very small amounts even after something goes into release. Now, self-publishing, when we started back in 2008, it was not a viable way to make any appreciable money. That is not the case today. It is very financially feasible. In fact, in many ways, it's even a little better financially because the author doesn't have to sell nearly as many books to earn a good income. It does require financial investment. So, unlike in traditional, where you don't have to take any money out of your pockets, you are going to have to take money out of your pockets to self-publish. And if you're self-publishing, your income is going to come primarily through the sales of ebooks. You'll get a small amount of money through paperback sales, and I'll talk to you a bit about how you can increase that money. But the vast majority is going to be through ebooks. All right, so let's look at a traditional case study for Jim C. Hines. He's what I would call a solid mid-list author. He's a fantasy author, and he started writing in 1995. His first published book was in 2006, so that's what I was talking about initially, about this 10,000 hours and 1 million words, and that time period actually is about right. My husband spent more than 10 years before he got his craft up. It looks like Jim took 11 years, but that's pretty typical. Jim quit his day job in 2015, and at that time, he had 11 books in print. So it just goes to show that you need multiple books in order to earn well. And early on, a lot of his income was from foreign sales. Again, being in the fantasy world, foreign sales did very well for him. So if we look at Jim's income, Jim was nice enough to share his income online. We can see that over a 10-year period, he showed the various breakdowns for the amount he got in the U.S., how much he got in foreign. He has a couple of little self-published works and some short stories, and he broke this down. If we grab data, what we'll see is that if you look in 2005 and 2006, he really wasn't making much money at all. Now, this is when, in 2006, is when his first book was released. In 2007, he had 3 books put out, and he still wasn't making much money, $17,000. In 2008, he made some really good money. He made $54,000. That's good money for a traditionally published mid-list author. Now, if Jim was not as bright of a guy as he was, he could have quit his day job then, thinking, oh, I'm making $54,000 a year, why don't I quit my day job? But the reality is, a lot of that money was from foreign sales, and income in publishing is very fickle. It's very volatile. You can have a good year one year and a terrible year the next. And in fact, we can see that Jim's income, when he had 5 books out, went down to $29,000. In 2010, he had $26,000. By 2011, he started making some good money again. He was making $43,000. And finally, in 2013, after he had 9 books released, he was making some decent money again, $62,000. And it wasn't until he had 3 years of really good money in the $50,000 to $60,000 range that he quit his day job. And I think that this is pretty indicative of what you would see from many traditionally published fantasy authors that are traditionally published in the mid-list. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about advances. Advances are upfront money for a book or a series. Now, some small publishers or digital first imprints don't offer advances at all. That's getting more and more common these days. But certainly if you're talking about the big 5, or if you're talking about a fairly large imprint, then there will be advance. Now, the way you can think about an advance is as a loan against earnings for your books. But it is a loan that you do not have to pay back, except under certain circumstances, which we'll cover in a moment. But if the book does poorly, let's say they give you a $10,000 advance, but it only earns $5,000 worth of royalty income to you, you don't have to pay back that $5,000. That basically becomes a loss to the publisher, and it's just gone. Now, usually the advances don't come to you all at once. They're usually done in payments. And the number of payments can be anywhere between 2 and 5 installments. In a 2 installment situation, they would be 50% when you sign the contract and 50% when the book is published. If you have another way to divide it is in thirds, where you get a third when you sign the contract, a third when you have your manuscript accepted In other words, your editor has gone over it and thinks that it's now ready to go into production. And then you would get the last third when you're in publishing, when it's published. The larger the advance, the more payments there are. Some of Mike's larger advances are split into fours. And the way that works is a quarter on signing, a quarter on acceptance, a quarter on publishing the hardcover, and then a quarter on publishing the paperback. I have heard them going up as far as 5, which would include the last payment being 1 year after the paperback. So very large advances sometimes are broken down into smaller chunks. And again, remember that only 1 in 5 books will earn out. By earning out, I mean that the amount of the royalties that come in from the sales eventually get higher than the advance, such that you'll get a real-life royalty check on a regular basis. All of Mike's books have earned out, so he does make additional money on them, but that is unusual. Like I said, only 20% of books earn out. All right, so let's look at a typical deal. Let's say that this particular author had a 3-book deal, and they are on a 3-payment schedule of $6,000 a book. So it's a total of $18,000 that they'll get for this contract. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but very typical of what you might see. So let's say that they're going to release these books starting in 2018, and the contract was signed in 2017. Well, what you'll see is that for each of the books, book 3 and book 2, you get your $2,000 on signing bonus. But usually you would get the first book accepted fairly quickly after signing. So book number 1 has both its signing amount and its on acceptance amount. Then if we go on to 2018, we'll see that the first book is published. So that's where it picks up its last $2,000 payment. The second book goes into acceptance, and so you get money for it. And then the third book hasn't been accepted, so you didn't get any additional money for it. And then in 2019, we'll see that the second book is published, the third book goes into acceptance, and then finally in 2020, that third book will be published. So this $18,000 is spread over 4 years, with the biggest chunk of money happening in 2017 for $8,000, and then a couple years of $4,000, and then $2,000. So not a lot of money, to say the least. Okay, one of the things that you have to know is how are your royalties calculated? What is the basis for them? And how do they treat returns? This is one of the reasons why you have to look over your contracts very carefully. You want to make sure that your contract says that the sales are based on actual sales minus actual returns. Sometimes publishers will say something like, we'll estimate returns, and they're always going to estimate returns high, so you don't want that. You also want to see whether, again, what is that the basis of the royalty on? Is it on list price? Is it on net profit? Is it on net income? Anything that says net had better be defined. For instance, usually a net income would be the amount of money that the publisher brings in. Net profit would be very dangerous because the publisher could attribute all kinds of costs to that, including the cost of the editors, the cost of the printing, the cost of the warehousing. And it kind of gets like Hollywood accounting, such that there never is any profit to the book, and therefore they don't owe you any royalties at all. So you need to make sure that those terms are very well defined if it is on net. Now, how often do you get paid? Let's say you're one of the few authors who do earn out. When will you get your money? Well, you get paychecks twice a year, and they're for 6-month periods, and they're delayed quite a bit. So, for instance, this is April, and we just got royalty checks for July through December of last year for those. And then again in October, we'll get sales that go from January to June. So if you're traditionally published, you have to get really good about managing your money. Okay, so what kind of royalties can you expect if you're with the Big Five? Well, print sales through the Big Five are based off of list price, and your hardcover is going to be 10% at the low end. If you sell more than 5,000 copies, those are the next 5,000 copies over the first 5,000 will be at 12.5%. And if you sold more than 10,000 copies, then all those copies will be at 15%. Those are called escalators. So generally there's a 5,000 book escalator at 10, 12.5, and 15%, and then there's no more escalators. Trade paperbacks are generally 7.5% without escalators. Mass market paperbacks, you usually see like 8% for the first 100,000 and 10% above 100,000. Ebooks are always based off of net. For all of the big five, is 25% of net. And it used to be in the a while ago, there was a big Department of Justice lawsuit against the publishers. And at the time, we all knew what everyone's cut was. We knew that the distributor was getting 30%, and then the publisher was getting 75%, and they were giving 25% of that over to the author. Well, nowadays, we don't know exactly what the cut is between the retailer and the publishers, but we pretty much think it's still around the 30%. So that would mean that the 30% goes to the retailer, 52.5% goes to the publisher, and 17.5% of that is going to go to the author. One of the reasons why ebooks don't change is because there are a number of contracts. For instance, my husband's contract that has an auto escalator clause in there, which says if the publisher raised the ebook royalty rate for any of their publishers, then his books from then on will be calculated at that new royalty rate. That's a good thing for Michael, because if they do change the percentage, he doesn't get locked into a contract at the old rate. But it is also one reason why the publishers are so non-incentivized to raise those royalty rates. As far as audio is concerned with the big five, they do the audio sales two different ways. One is if they are the producers of it, in which case you get 25% of net. And the other way is if they sell it to an audiobook producer, in which case you get 50% of what is sold. And we're actually going to do a little more deep dive into audio in just a moment. So I'm going to leave that there, and we're going to circle back around to that shortly. Okay, so if the retailer is getting 50 to 55% for paper, and 30% for ebook, and 65% for audio, and if the agent is taking 15% commission, which is standard, I did a little breakdown to see who makes how much on various books. For instance, if we had a $25 full price hardcover, the retailer would make $12.50 on that, the publisher would make $10 on it, the author would make $2.13, and the agent would make 38 cents. If we look at that same hardcover at 15%, the author's income comes up from $2.13 to $3.19. On a trade paperback that's selling at $16, the author's making about $1 on it. For a mass market paperback at $8, the author is making about 54 cents. And if we calculate that out on the ebook, the author makes about $1.49. So as you can see, the authors make the most of their money on hardcovers, and then ebooks, and then lastly on the paperbacks. Now, many authors are never produced in hardcovers. For instance, Michael has three major contracts. One is with Orbit, and it's based off of trade paperback only. And then he also has some contracts with Del Rey, and they have both hardcover and paperback. Okay, now when you're dealing with traditional publishing, there are some gotchas that you have to be concerned about. The first gotcha is that not all royalties are created equal. So even though I just told you that you're generally getting 10 to 15% on your hardcovers, not always. Because, for instance, Canadian sales and other foreign sales are significantly less than that. I think usually Canadian is like 2/3 of what the U.S. is, and the foreign sales are a great deal less. In fact, they're usually based off of net rather than list. And the bottom line is, on foreign sales, the author makes next to nothing. There also is this sneaky little thing in contracts referring to high discount sales. Basically what it says is if the publisher sells to a retailer at a high discount, that the author's royalty will go down. Basically, it's a way for the publisher to steal from Peter, being the author, to pay Paul, the distributor. So the really nasty thing about this is the publisher can change their royalty rate by like 1%. And they will actually, even though that they're selling the book to the distributor at a much lower cost, or not a much lower, 1% lower, the reality is they make a lot more money because the author's rate goes down so significantly. In fact, instead of making like, you know, $2.50 to $3.80 a book, you're making like 60 cents a book. And we're seeing more and more sales coming in under high discount rates. There's also something called reserve returns. I'm actually going to dig down into this quite a bit more in just a second. But what it is a way for the publisher to kind of keep some money on hand because they don't know how much returns are going to be. And so some of your initial royalty statements will be significantly less than what you actually sold because they're only going to report how they're going to hold back some of those sales in case returns come in. And we're going to go through that a lot in the next slide. As I mentioned, you do not have to pay back a royalty if your sales are bad. For instance, if you had a $10,000 advance, you only made $5,000 in royalty, you do not have to make that short up. But if you fail to produce the book and the publisher's already paid you the on-signing bonus, then they are going to ask for that back. That is something you need to think about if you have very large contracts. For instance, there was a rather large contract that Michael was going to sign where they were going to give him 50% on signing and 50% on publication. And I thought, well, what happens if Mike dies? Because then he won't deliver that book. And that publisher's certainly going to want that money back. So I had to put a life insurance policy on Michael until that contract was fulfilled and those books were delivered. Just because, I didn't want to be in a position where they were asking for money that I've already paid back to Uncle Sam and so forth. So some things you need to think about. The other thing about another gotcha with traditional relating to money is make sure that your contract doesn't get you into a weird limbo state. Usually the only way in which the author can revoke the contract or cancel the contract is if the publisher doesn't get the book in print within a certain amount of time, generally 2 years. But you will usually say 2 years after acceptance. And the question comes, well, what if it never gets to acceptance? Then it basically is in a limbo state. So there's some aspects like that you have to be concerned about when you're dealing with traditionally published books. Okay, so let's go back and visit this return on reserves for just a moment, because this is something I didn't understand when we started in traditional, and I don't think a lot of traditionally published authors understand that. So first you need to realize how bookstores work. And what you need to realize is that bookstores don't buy books from the publisher, they get them on consignment. In other words, they get the books without paying, and then they only have to pay for the books that walk out the store. If a book is sitting on their shelf and it's not selling well, they can package it up and send it back to the publisher, and they will get full credit for this. So what we'll see is a bookstore might order a whole bunch of books, but a whole bunch of them might go back to the publishers. And in fact, when you're trying to figure out how many books you've sold as a traditionally published author, it's very hard to determine, because all the publisher can really tell you is how many books walked out of the warehouse. They don't know how many of them are sitting on store shelves. They don't know whether they actually got sold through. A lot of that reporting takes a long time for it to make it back to the publisher. So one of the things that we learned early on, when we first looked at Michael's very first initial statement, I thought his sales were really low. I thought, wow, this is really disappointing. I would have thought he sold more than this. And the reason is because that particular royalty report did not have something called a unit ledger. Excuse me. A unit ledger is a report from the publisher that indicates how many copies they're keeping in the return reserve and how many copies are being reported on the royalty statements. Now, what the contract will say is the publisher can have a reasonable and customary amount set aside for reserves. But what's reasonable and customary? To me, a reasonable amount might be 10 or 20%. Well, I can tell you that in the first royalty period, Mike's publishers were keeping 60% of the books on reserve. And that's on a book that ended up having like somewhere between 6 and 8% of returns. So they're holding back much more money than they need to. The way it usually works is after a number of periods, usually 2 or 3, that reserve will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it'll eventually go away. But it is something you have to watch because it is basically them not reporting money that's owed you for a while. So you need to make sure that they're tracking the returns and everything is on the up and up there. Okay, so let's turn our attention to self-publishing. Now, in self-publishing, the author is going to have some self-publishing costs. These are kind of some ballpark that you can think of relating to costs. Cover design. The nice thing is nowadays there are a lot of different cover designers out there. They do really great work at quite reasonable prices. You could easily get a decent cover design from somewhere between $100 and $350. That is well done. Copying editing would run you anywhere between $350 and $1,200. I can tell you I use the same editors that my Big 5 publisher uses, and we are charged about $1,200 on like a 130,000 word book. So if someone's asking you for $2,500 or God forbid $5,000, which I sometimes hear people bumping into, you're being heavily overcharged. If the editors at some of the biggest publishers are only doing it for $1,200, there's no reason you have to pay double or even quadruple that. Structural editing is not something that I recommend people hire. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is structural editors are very expensive. Number 2, the very good ones are so busy you can't hire them even if you wanted to. And number 3 is structural editing is a very particular talent, and it's very easy to get wrong. And so I don't kind of trust the structural editors who have time on their hands and what they can do. So what I suggest instead is that you utilize beta readers and find some critique partners, other authors who can look at your book and you look at their book. And that is a way of you getting structural editing from multiple sources, i.e. a couple of authors, a couple of beta readers. And I think A, it won't cost you anything, and B, I think you'll get a lot of perspectives, and you'll get a much better structural editing. As far as layout is concerned, it'll probably cost you about $50 to get the ebook laid out, maybe $250 to get the print book laid out. So, when all is said and done, somewhere between $500 and $1,500 to get a book released. Obviously, you want to keep your costs down in order to get a high return on investment, but it also has to be quality. My opinion is that that if you do not produce a book that is every bit as professional as a traditional publishing book, you might as well not self-publish because it has to stand up toe-to-toe. In fact, people shouldn't be able to recognize that it's a self-published book. It should look like any book produced by any publisher. Okay, now as I said before, most of your income in self-publishing is going to be through ebooks, and there's kind of a big decision you need to make regarding ebooks, and that is whether you're going to be in wide distribution or whether you're going to go into something called Kindle Unlimited, which requires you only to sell your book on Amazon. I'm going to start off by talking about wide distribution. So this would assume that you have your book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and the iBookstore and Google Play and the Nook and the Kobo and a whole bunch of various other sources. Basically, these are the breakdowns for what your percentage is. So for instance, Amazon, you get 70% if your book is priced between $2.99 and $9.99. If you're outside that range, you only get 35%. Kobo and Apple are also at 70%. Barnes & Noble is a little bit less, is at 65%. And in general, most of your sales will come from Amazon when you're in wide distribution. Now, I wouldn't say that it's completely insignificant. I probably get, $20,000 or $30,000 a year from my non-Amazon ebook sales for my self-published works. But that's probably only 10 or 20% of my overall ebook sales. To get your book on various sites like Apple and Kobo and Barnes & Noble, you can use a distribution partner such as Smashwords, and they'll take 50%. Or Draft2Digital, they'll take 10%. I've used both of these companies. They're good. They work well. The only thing I would recommend is that you keep your distribution with Amazon direct. Do not use Smashwords or Draft2Digital to kind of get between you and Amazon. And the reason for that is there have been times when Amazon's been in dispute with a various partner, and they have removed those books from the market. So you might find your book kind of caught up in a feud between, for instance, Amazon and Smashwords or Amazon and Draft2Digital. So if you have a direct relationship with Amazon, that can happen. Okay, so to this here, if, for instance, you had your book priced at, let's say, $3.99, you would make $2.79 for that book. Now, what a lot of self-published authors do who are in Kindle Unlimited is they will make box sets where their book's page count is very large. So, if you had like 3 books, and let's say your book, it was like 1,000 pages, you could actually make much more than what you would get at the $9.99 price point. So that's a strategy that a lot of people use. Generally speaking, now keep in mind that when you're in the Kindle Select program, such that you're in the Kindle Unlimited library, it doesn't mean that people can't also buy your books, because they certainly can. And so you'll get a mix of someone who buys your book outright and someone who reads it through the Kindle Unlimited program. Generally speaking, most self-published authors who use that, they're seeing about 60% of their income through the KU, and then 40% of their income comes from direct sales. I'm not in the Kindle Unlimited program. I've tried it a couple times. It doesn't work very well for Michael and his books, and there are a number of reasons why. So we're always in wide distribution. There are a couple of other things that the Kindle Unlimited program gives you. For instance, you can make your book free for 5 days out of the 90-day enrollment period. And they also allow you to do countdown deals where, for instance, you might put your book on sale for $2.99, and there'll be a little timer above it that says, this book will go back to its regular price in 2 days and 4 minutes, and it'll count down so that people get a sense of urgency that they should buy it sooner rather than later. We saw that you were getting $3.92 if it's sold on Amazon. So, for $8.91 versus, $3 and change is a much better profit for you. We also sell ebooks, for instance, and again, Amazon's going to be taking 30% of that right off the top. But if you sell the ebook directly, the only thing you have to pay is the PayPal fee. So you only got to pay like 44 cents. So the profit margin on selling ebooks direct is very, very high. Okay. I want to go back to this and look at the various options when you talk about a $25 hardcover. And you can go through this math independently, but I just want to show you how things break down differently. So for a book that I self-publish, that I print up a bunch of copies for, such that my printing is like $2.20 a book. When I sell that book directly on my site or through something like a Kickstarter, I'm making $21.98 a book, as opposed to when I'm traditionally selling the book, I'm making between $2.13 and $3.19 a book. You know, the difference is just substantial. If the book is sold on Amazon and it's a self-published book, I'm going to make about $8.45 on that. So certainly $8.45 is much better than the $2.13 to $3.19 that I get through traditional, but it doesn't come anywhere near to comparing to the $22 I get when I sell direct. So bottom line, if you're traditionally published or you're self-published, I highly recommend that you do some selling direct. Not only do you get the emails of the people, but you can offer them signed copies. You can even dedicate their copies. And as you can see, you make much more money. Now, yes, it does take a little bit of labor to package these up. I can tell you when we started out, we did all the shipping ourselves. We now actually have a fulfillment company, such that the orders come in and they send out the books and we don't have to do anything for them. So that if your volume gets high enough, it might warrant using a fulfillment house. This Kickstarters. So that was Age of Legend, Age of Death, and Age of Empire. And, you know, I made, $400,000 just off of the Kickstarters for those books. And then I sold the audio rights on those books for over $400,000. So I had almost $1 million just from audio and Kickstarters on those. Need a publisher. So, you know, when you're looking at money, I just want you to realize that, particularly in certain genres, audiobook rights are very valuable. And realize that if you go with traditional publishing, you're going to get a very small cut of that pie. And you got to really take in consideration whether it's not better for you to sell the audio rights yourself, and then, and then you just have to self-publish the rest of the books. To kind of show you how our unit sales break down, if Mike's got kind of two major series, one is Riyria and one are Legends of the First Empire. You know, his audio sales are the majority of them are through audio. So 46% and 42% respectively for those series. 36 and 38% in ebook, and the print is only 18 to 20%. You know, ebooks, the print books is really, really, really small these days. And it's going to get smaller, particularly if Borders ends up closing its doors, which they were already struggling. And now that we're going through, the current struggles we're having with the COVID-19 virus, that might be the coffin and, the last nail in their coffin. So anyways, audiobooks selling much more than ebooks are these days, and something to keep in mind. Okay, now one other thing with the audio rights is there are many different ways you can sell this. You can self-publish the book, and if you're self-published, you would use a company called ACX. And when you do it through ACX, you can either get 20% if you use a producer. Basically, they'll get 20%, you'll get 20%, and they will pay all the fees for the studio and the narrator and the various SAG-AFTRA monies that go to the actors' retirement fund and healthcare fund, and then the mastering and all those types of things. To self-produce an audiobook, it's pretty expensive. You could easily run $3,000 to $5,000 through the production yourself. So you might have a producer do it, and they will take 20%, and they will incur those upfront costs. If you want to produce it yourself, you can get up to 40% of the money for that book. That's a pretty high percentage and something to consider. But now let's look at the various ways that this can be sold if you're in traditional. Because in traditional, it's going to depend on who buys it and how it's sold. For instance, you can sell that book directly to Audible. You can sell that book to an audio producer such as Recorded Books or Tantor Media or Podium Publishing. And then there'll be a separate breakdown. It could be sold to a traditional publisher, and they could self-produce it in-house. Or you could sell it to a traditional publisher, and that traditional publisher may keep that right and then sell it as a subsidiary, which is what I mentioned we did, initially, which was a really bad deal for us because it's so small. But I just want to kind of show you what some of these numbers are, okay? So if you were to sell the book directly to Audible, which we've done a number of deals with that, generally there's only two people in the equation, right? I mean, there's the Audible and there's the author. Possibly an agent if they were involved, in the deal. We happen to do all our audio contracts without an agent. But, so you're getting 12.8%. Now, that's significantly less than 20% of self-publishing or the 40% of self-publishing when you're doing the costs through ACX. But it's still, a decent rate. Now, I have a number of books that I have sold directly to a producer, such as Recorded Books. And in that case, Audible is going to get 65%. And then the audio producer is going to take the remaining 40%, and they're going to split them between you and them. And typically, what we'll see is like the audio producer will get like 26%, and the author will get like 7 or 8%. And then, as I said, if you're selling it directly through the publisher, if it's sold as a subsidiary, then it's split 50-50 between the publisher and the author. And if they produce it, it's basically the same as if you sold it to a subsidiary publisher. So as you can see here, the author's percentage is going to be anywhere from as high as 40% if they self-publish, 20% if they self-publish without any outlay of money because there's a producer involved, and then 12 to 13% if they're dealing with an agent in Audible, and it can get down as low as 3 to 4% if it's sold through a subsidiary. And then I just took those numbers and I, showed them out, and you can see that in the case of the subsidiary, the author's only getting 50 cents on a dollar, whereas if they sell it directly to Audible, they're getting like $1.73, so 3 times as much. So anyways, I just want you to consider, audio rights and the and because it is such a lucrative aspect of publishing right now. I don't think it's something that a lot of people pay attention to, but it's been very, very lucrative for us, and so it is something that we pay a great deal of attention to. I don't know how this particular the remote conference is working. I don't know whether there's going to be a time for me to get on and answer questions from you or not, or whether you just want to send me questions afterwards. So if you saw this presentation and you had questions on it, you can write me at my husband's email, michael.sullivan.dc@gmail.com. And in the subject line, write to publish. That is my meetup group that I had mentioned before. That just gives me some information to look at that, because both my husband and I are in that account, and there's some things that he takes care of and some things I take care of. And anything that has a subject line of write to publish, I know that that's for me to deal with. And if it's from a fan, it's something that he needs to deal with. And I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. But that's kind of the basics of money matters, and when we're involved with self and traditional publishing. As I said before, I don't think that there's a right answer. I think we've made good money traditional publishing. We've made good money self-publishing. You know, they're different routes, but both can be profitable for you. But it's just good to know like what to expect in the various scenarios, so you don't go into this completely blind like we were when we started. So, in conclusion, I just want to thank you for your time and attention, and have a great day.